reception of the Eucharist
is a form.
Is a form of giving thanks to God.
Right. Okay. A novice.
Okay. All right. Well, because the Eucharist as a term remains certainly central in the Catholic understanding. It gets a little bit blurred by the Protestant notion of the Lord's Supper and things like that. So the term, depending on where you're coming from culturally, may be more or less familiar to you. But it goes back to the beginning, and it's been maintained, certainly in Catholicism, and the root notion is to give thanks. Which is relevant because what's being said here in Novitas Mundi, and again last time in today's assignment, is that what we're dealing with in the context of thinking now occurring is the Eucharist of existence itself, which is therefore that existence itself somehow or other is now intelligibly the form of thanksgiving. And thanksgiving implies, which by the way also ritually in the reception of the Eucharist is just that, receptivity. Right? So one of the receiving of the Eucharist, right, and the giving of thanks is the same act. So what you give for a gift, what do you do when somebody gives you a gift? You give them thanks, right? So that's the notion. Except the identity of the two, as it were, in the one act would be the root idea. Since you asked the question, I should ask if there are any other questions. Specific or otherwise. At the moment? Okay. I want to just back up a little bit into the last chapter. I think we more or less had gotten to page 431, where, I kind of recall reading the top of that page, 431. That's where we introduced from the margin of my text the notion of the incarnation of the transcendental ego as a way of summarizing, encapsulating the transition or the difference between the Kantian notion of the synthetic unity of apperception and what in the thinking now occurring would be the synthetic unity of perception. So perception itself is an act of unity sans self-reference, sans self, without any notion of self. But that is, I'd say, it's not just the abstraction, as it were, the elimination of the self from the notion of the synthetic unity, or, another way of putting that, it's not just the subtraction of the notion of self from the notion of the transcendental I, ego, right? But that subtraction cannot be real unless the so-called subtraction of the self from the transcendental ego is just another way of understanding the incarnation of the transcendental ego. In other words, looking at it retrospectively, you could say that it's the self-reference that has kept the transcendental ego from being, up until this point in history, fully incarnate. Just say. Okay. So I want to turn through the next few pages, which are...
Can I ask a question about
Sure.
how that relates to Husserl and the phenomenologists? And the I had a chance to look over some of Sartre's stuffs recently, and the idea of consciousness being conscious of an object.
Right. Intentionality is another way in which that's characterized. That's the phrase,
Right.
Intentionality. Yeah.
So is the of then, I would imagine, gone in this case of the TNO? Or how is it different? Because you said at some points that the consciousness itself is identical with the object. There's no longer that space for there to be an of.
Well, you mentioned Sartre and Husserl in the same breath, and so I would make this distinction. When it comes to Husserl, the difference would be in Husserl. Now, let me start with what is not the difference from Husserl. The non-difference from Husserl is that in Husserl you have an ego, right, which is the infinite a priori of the world construction that is the transcendental subjectivity. So what is not different in the thinking now occurring vis-a-vis Husserl, what is not different is the continuing ego. What is different is that the ego in the thinking now occurring is not the center of subjectivity, right? And therefore, the analog of that, the corollary of that, is that unlike Husserl, the world construction of a ego, which is not the center of a subjectivity, is not the construction of a phenomenal experience that has been distinguished from, and must continue to be distinguished from, as such, from substance or from existence.
Right.
Okay. So once existence is identically substance, and we have a constructive ego of the existence which is identically substance, then we moved into the thinking now occurring. And so there are certain formal similarities to Husserl's phenomenology, and in fact, somewhere in the text, I think, and certainly in class, I've used the expression, one way of characterizing the thinking now occurring in context, is an absolute phenomenology, right? A phenomenology without reserve, which goes to the point I was just making in a different context, that when the transcendental ego is incarnate, as it is in the thinking now occurring, it is so only because it is no longer a self, which implies the distance and the reserve and the holding back, which one of the most brilliant forms of which is Husserl's phenomenology, right? In which the ego fundamentally, as the center of a transcendental subjectivity, withholds itself from the judgment of substance or existence, even though it is otherwise, now I use this word, slow down here, authoritative. In other words, it is in some sense, it's a kind of an abstraction of the Kantian idea that the transcendental ego is the author of its own experience, which is that which he says Hume, it never occurred to Hume to imagine that, and therefore Hume, got bogged down in a kind of modern skepticism.
What seems interesting when you read Husserl detail.
Oh, no, excuse me. It's not fair to you to do this, but there was another half of the question I wanted to ask.
That's why
it was the
hesitate.
Sartre thing.
Yeah.
Now, Sartre does a critique of Husserl, and he does it in a nice little book, which you might want to read sometime since you're into this stuff, it sounds like, called The Transcendence of the Ego. Have you read that? You know what
I've read it a long time. I just picked it up again.
Okay.
So I just read the.
All right. So what Sartre is saying in there, vis-a-vis Husserl, is to take Sartre's. So what is the thinking now occurring? What does it share with Sartre? How is it and how is it not related to Sartre? All right? It's related to Sartre because it wants to, like Sartre, it agrees with Sartre that the ego is an opaque element in the pure transcendental subjectivity of Husserl's phenomenology. And so Sartre wants to identify the ego as something that is transcendent to the transcendental consciousness. The ego for Sartre is really a thing which he puts, as it were, on the side of the world, right? On the side, makes it the object, right? And therefore, the pure transcendental subjectivity in Sartre's critique of Husserl is now egoless, as for Sartre it ought to be, but it is egoless as a pure. I think the word he uses, which is a nice distinction between the notion of transparency, which is dominant in the thinking now occurring, if I recall correctly, in Being and Nothingness, Sartre's term, where one would like to say, if one was a now occurring thinker, you would want to say transparency. He much more carefully says translucency. Okay, so a translucent pane lets the light through. You see, but it's not transparent. You can't see what's going on the other side of the pane, right? So the point of contact with Sartre is to get rid of the opaque element in the transcendental consciousness. The point of contact with Husserl is to maintain the ego. Therefore, the ego, we need an ego, which is not an opaque element in an otherwise transcendental consciousness. You see, so if the ego is not a self, then there's no need. Once it's no longer the center of subjectivity, there's no need to remove it from the transcendental consciousness in order to get the kind of openness to the world that Sartre is aiming at. Does that make sense to you, what I'm saying?
Yeah,
okay.
For the most part.
So, well,
but it's okay.
okay.
We
right.
can go on.
So again, it's the thinking now occurring in so many areas is, which I think is the one common element, if there's any common element between the thinking now, fundamental common element between the thinking now occurring and previous history of thought, is that the only way you can make a new move, whether it's essential or inessential, right, is a synthesis of the truth of the past. Right? In other words, it's not a question. There's no way of denying the truth in Sartre. There's no way of denying the truth in Husserl. It's distinguishing the truth in them, in their time, in history, from what distinguishing in them the truth that, as it were, is carried forward and saved. And I can use that in a kind of theological context too. You see, saved. And by distinguishing it from what remains in the past. And the most radical break, unprecedented in the history of thought, that is occurring, the thinking now occurring, is that a lot of truth can be brought forth as long as it is not contaminated by self. Right? So the fundamental thing that has to be left behind is the centrality of self-consciousness, but the formal truths associated with that, either in Husserl or in Sartre, or wherever, can be saved, as it were.
Okay.
Now,
in Husserl, there's a very funny thing that happens, because it seems as if the bracketing of the natural standpoint is being undertaken in order to get a hold of the basic structures of consciousness, so that they can be spelled out without having them be contaminated with the interaction of the subjectivity with the forms of the world. Then the questions deepen, and you start having ontological-like questions about what the basis of all this is, as if he were talking not about a strategy for creating a microscope by which he could elaborate the structures, but something that has ontological significance in its own right.
Something that is actually, in that sense, closer to what we might call the claim, if we want to step back, the claim of thinking now occurring.
Which is
that this thinking is ontological.
Yeah. But what I want to say is that if you leave Husserl, not his ontological claim, which is within the world of transcendent self-consciousness.
Right.
But the structures that he elaborates, what he actually discerns there. Now, when you say you're taking forth what's true, are you saying, well, you could accept the entire set of structures that he elaborates, because it's a very, very Baroque.
Yeah, I don't want to go that far.
Yeah, okay, but here, this is my question. What seems to be, sometimes I think that this is the opportunity, or what you might mean, or what it, is that the elaboration of such structures becomes an open matter and open to the creativity of us.
Okay.
So that, you could take Husserl's structures, leave out self-consciousness, leave out his ontological commitments, but examine those structures and do with them what one feels is appropriate. But you could also go some other way, because what seems to happen is you see that the possibility of elaborating such schemas, rather than being ideal schemas which dictate then what is true, are themselves creative possibilities.
Right. Let's pause there.
Okay,
That's
good.
right.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm following you.
Okay. I just want to abstract from these pages, which have all these geometric drawings on it, what I think is relevant here, and that is, first of all, that what this leads up to, the cube here, you will find probably later in the work and elsewhere in what I do, reference to the absolute dead center cube. Right? So this is the section in which, as it were, that was come upon or discovered or whatever. And the lead up to it is on page 432 and 433. There's a kind of backwards reference in a how shall I say, in an iconic way, to both Peirce and to Altizer, right? And if you were to follow the footnotes back, you would see that the image on 432 is an image of that. Maybe we should just take a brief look so that we have a visual understanding of what we're talking about. If we go back to 153, is that right? No, I'm sorry, that's footnote 153. 294 and following. Now, this is something we actually didn't do in class, although we read through it, we didn't do it in class. But if you look at the image on page 295, that is an image that I have constructed at that point in my critique of Peirce to create an image of how Peirce's understanding is to be understood. And now, so in other words, he on the previous page imagines a multiplication and addition tables on page 294. On page 294, in the bottom half of page 294, I quote from him, and you can see there he's got what he calls multiplication and addition tables that involve three elements. All right. So in other words, it's the same old issue. Right. The issue is he's doing in the section from which I'm quoting his work here what he calls a trichotomic, as opposed to a dichotomous. It's a trichotomous mathematics, right? And his basic notion is that trichotomous mathematics is always going to be, as he says at the beginning of this section, as I quote him, a 2 times 3 affair, right? And that leads me to summarize, by way of comparison, Peirce's logic as 1 equals 2 times 3, which was a typo that I corrected, you'll remember, and then to compare it to the thinking now occurring as a 2 equals 1 times 3. And so, okay, so I don't want to get into that. I don't want to have to go. We can sometime if it comes up again, but the point I'm making is just I'm refreshing you on the notion that the basic critique of the thinking now occurring against Peirce is that Peirce's trichotomous mathematics and his logical triad is ultimately a dualistically rooted, right? It ultimately doesn't get beyond a dualistic root. And here you have a very good visual example, which we didn't touch on previously in class, on page 295, where he himself, remember we had the dispute here about the meaning of RST and PQO or whatever it was, and I was trying to emphasize that the issue in the reduction in the thinking now occurring to the 2/3 as opposed to the 1/3 in Peirce required understanding that the issue hinges around whether or not the elements RST, OPQ, whether they in themselves are intrinsically relative or whether they are intrinsically indifferent to relationship, right? Now Peirce, as I was saying, they are in Peirce's thinking. They have to be intrinsically indifferent to relationship. You see? They're arbitrary, they're just arbitrary pointers, or actually they're letters that stand for points, which points are, in the ordinary mathematical way of thinking, indifferent, in points of indifference. Okay, so Peirce understands that. So, trying to meet the thinking now occurring halfway, you understand, not at all literally, okay, but as it were, retrospectively, he says, okay, these things are really meaningless, but let's give them names. We'll violate, he says there, look on page 294 in that first quotation from him, yet in this particular instance, we can adapt our doctrine better to thoroughgoing trichotomy. See, he's searching for, you got it? Right? In other words, he wants a thoroughgoing trichotomy. So in order to get that, he says what? Well, we can get closer to that by derogating a little from the dignified meaninglessness of pure algebra. Okay? So now he gives names. It's almost like, if he were coming 150 years later or whatever, he might call them 0, unum, and 1. Okay? Of course, if he did call them 0, unum, and 1, he would have to be doing a brand new logic, an essentially new logic, and we wouldn't get the results that he gets. Do you see? But what is his attempt? What is his attempt what is his attempt to get to a thoroughgoing trichotomy, as he calls it? What does it involve? It means, for him, it involves arbitrarily giving to what he understands to be, in and of themselves, meaningless algebraic symbols, giving them names. Do you see? Making them intelligible. Right? A name relates me. My name relates me. In many different ways, to my grandfather, to my family, depending on which one, my middle name, to my, etc. Right? Okay. So so he does that, but notice he does it quite self-consciously, quite deliberately, and he acknowledges what he's doing as, in his world, an arbitrary move which will help him explain better a thoroughgoing trichotomy. Now, the critique is, all right, give them the names, make the otherwise meaningless elements meaningful, right, in Peircean terms, in pragmatic terms, but notice, and this is the key thing, when he gives them the names, he gives them by no means accidentally or incidentally, by no means thoughtlessly. He gives them the name of night and day, and night comes up today in today's reading when we quote Altizer quoting Joyce, James Joyce, that the not language, NAT language, is, as Altizer points out in his text, is used by Joyce, is the Danish word for night, right? But as Altizer takes advantage of the fact that it's pronounced not, okay? But so this is a thoroughgoing idea. It goes back. It's not just James and Joyce and Altizer and so forth, right? The night, the negative, you see, over against the day, the positive, the light, right? And so you can see here, by the way, the setup for Altizer's insistence, I think again in today's reading, that the dark is the light. The darkness is the light. That's where Altizer is at. In other words, the light in Altizer shines in, not just in, because you can go back to the Gospel of John to get that. The light shone in the darkness, and the darkness grasped it not. That much is not new, right? But what Altizer is insisting upon is that not simply that the light shines in the darkness, but it shines in and as the darkness. Okay, that he identifies, as he would put it, the following Nicholas Cusanus, the coincidence of opposites, right? If light and dark are the opposites, then in Altizer they are, as it were, absolutely identified in some sense. Okay. Well, what made that possible for Altizer to do is Peirce. What made it possible is that Altizer, despite himself, despite his self-consciousness, is some kind of very deep negative pragmatist. Okay. And so the setup for that in American thought, in American pragmatism, you see right here in this image that I've created to illustrate what's going on in Peirce, is that I have these two, day and night, and then the third is dawn, you see, or twilight. You see, this is an imagistic, metaphorical way in which Peirce is reiterating his fundamental, how shall I say, ontological premise, which I quoted to you many days back, maybe months, that despite the fact that it was apparently clear to Parmenides, the pre-Socratic philosopher without whom I think Western thought would have come to an abortive, premature end, despite the fact that Parmenides says either it is or it isn't, and if it isn't, forget it, and we'll just go with what is. That's Parmenides, and that triggers the most creative part of Greek philosophy. But Peirce, reviewing that in the 19th century post-Hegel, post-Kant, says, well, it sounds plausible, either it is or it isn't, but we flatly deny it, says Peirce, right? We flatly deny it because we understand that insensibly, is his word, being and nothingness merge. Being merges together with nothingness, which, by the way, it doesn't in Sartre, who is still too European. Nothingness in Sartre just slips around on the surface of being. It cannot penetrate being. Do you see that? And that's why the Americans don't know from, despite the superficial similarities, the Americans don't know from existentialism. It's un-American. Existentialism is un-American. Okay, it's the notion of a ultimate futility of existence. Very un-American, right? It's meaningful. Now, we haven't gotten there. We're never actually going to fully arrive, right? But we're making progress, and we're going to make this progress indefinitely into the indefinite future, right? That's because the nothingness that otherwise slips and slides without penetrating being in Sartre's consciousness, in the pragmatic consciousness articulated by Peirce, it actually doesn't slip and slide. It penetrates. A better way of my putting it, they interpenetrate one another, right? There's an interpenetrating conditionality in the relationship. And the image for that is the dawn, right? What is dawn doing? What's going on at dawn? The night and the and the sky and the night and the day are they're interpenetrating at for that moment, whatever that moment is. So the logical point, which goes back to the which I must have said somewhere else. Oh yeah, when I handed out the handout with the expanding triangle with all those beautiful green and yellow and magenta triangles and so forth, and I gave you the comparative triangle from Hellerstein's pivotal logic, which is visually applying his logical operations to his 3 digits, is a dualism. It just manifests itself as a dualism. Okay. Well, that's what I'm saying here. In other words, the dawn is the image of a third element in a so-called trinary logic, which is an element in a trinary logic called trinary, but actually radically dualistic, by virtue of the fact that the third thing is the intermediate. Do you see? And dawn is the intermediate stage between night and day, or dusk. Take your pick. Between day and night. Do you see? When the third is that blending of the two, then it lacks the kind of absolute equality, do you see, as third, as the mediator, that is fundamental to the notion of the unum in the 0 unum 1. All right. Okay. So this image on, go back to 432, is just an abstraction. If you look at it there, it's just abstracting in the most bare form the dualism, the ultimate dualism that is imaged on page 295, and then what's being said. Some people are put off by this stuff, but some people are helped by this stuff. In other words, there are different ways of learning. This is what teachers discover very late in life, right? And so some students can learn everything perfectly well verbally, and they just don't get it when you start drawing things. And there are others who can't understand what you're saying, but if you draw it, they got it. Okay? So I don't know who's who here, but we got it covered. We got it covered. All right? We're drawing it and we're saying it. And for those of you who prefer the drawing, you see that empty circle there, right? That's Altizer compared to the positive pragmatism upon which he depends, right? You could say, in a certain sense, pragmatism draws a certain circle, you say, and Altizer empties it out. He reduces even the dualistic trichotomous logic of Peirce. He reduces that to nothing, you see, and then again, following the same lines on the bottom of 433. I retrieved that image from, God knows where, 158, 275 maybe, or 290. Yeah, sure. So there on 275, we did spend a little bit of time on that, explaining its relationship to the material at the top of 274, and that's the material by the way, in which I subsequently posted a explanatory article on the forum. But anyway, I'm just trying to show you something of the continuity of what's going on here. So here again, in the same kind of way, I've abstracted the bare structure of the image on 275 and transposed it onto 433, just again as an index of which acknowledges, how shall I put it, which just visually acknowledges in the sequence, acknowledges both the indebtedness of the nothing in Altizer to its pragmatic background, but then as it were, right, fills in that nothingness, do you see, with a structure, the internal workings of which are foundational or solid, do you see, or also intelligible, right, would be another implication here. And so it's in that context. All right, so that's a kind of very brief visual summary, so to speak, of the basic moves here. And then over on page 434, this is why I really like this, because you have to understand, you just take my word for it, you don't just trust me. I mean, this is not a setup, all right? So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, well, now, I don't know why, and I can't remember, I just don't remember why. We're going to have to make a structure here, and it's obviously I know intuitively it's this square, which is brought forward from previous thing with the diagonals through it, right? But I want to do the Hebrew, right? So I say to myself, what about what the Hebrew for diagonal or diameter is, right? So I look it up, and there on page 434, you see the fourth line, the absolute diameter, that is the integral product of the Hebrew for diameter or diagonal, is 1.44 times 10 to the fourth. All right. Now the reason I'm calling your attention to that is that, in other words, I started the construction of the cube by looking for the diagonal of the square. The cube is just a square into the third dimension, right? Okay. So what is this? I want to put some numbers. You see what I want to do? I want to go from the logic, the pure logical understanding, or the pure conceptual understanding. I want to say, well, all right, I've got these images here, but they don't have any numbers attached to them, right? I want to measure these things, right? So I want to get what is the mathematical linguistic anchor in the context of what we're doing here of diagonal. Well, it turns out in the Hebrew it's 1.44, right, times 10 to the fourth. And if I divide that through by 100, I get 144. All right. So if I divide it through by or another way of putting it, if I reduce it in the context of the linguistic analysis to the Hebrew for to create, you see, in other words, if I predicate of the diagonal that it is the creation diagonal, which becomes a term used in this part of the chapter, then I get the number 144. Now, here's what's interesting to me. That's the way I was proceeding, and I had nothing else in mind. It turns out, as becomes clear in the next few pages, that a cube, the diagonal of whose side is 144, all right, is the area of the sides of that are 3/4 of 82944. And when I discovered that, I said, I'm on the right track. Okay, but what I'm trying to get at is that this is, again, working out of a kind of naive reliance upon allowing oneself to be guided by the mathematical reading of the Hebrew and taking it seriously. All right. So taking it seriously, I begin to construct a cube, which I discover in the process. All right, is the ultimate structure of which, I'll explain in a moment, is going to be a function of, or the ultimate area structure of which is going to be 82944 in abstract units. Okay. Now all right. So I do that. I'm just calling. I don't want to dwell on that, but I just want to call it to your attention. And then I say on page 434, a little below that, again about 8, maybe 9 lines down on page 434, the total surface area. What I just said is the total surface area of this absolute dead center cube is then 6.2208 times 10 to the fourth, which is what I just said, 3/4 of 82944. The perfectly unique natural number functioning as 1 qua integral product relations, and the extended base factor of the Hebrew for absolute dead center. And that absolute dead center times the Hebrew for nothing, right, is the surface area of the cube. It's the 6208 times 10 to the fourth. All right. Now, what I then do on page 434 at the bottom, I apply this mathematics to an analysis of the cube, which you see imaged there on 435. Now, what's the significance of that analysis? The significance of that analysis, I might say right off the top of my head right now, is its restraint. Okay? Because if you give me a cube and I divide it through, right, with a plane, and then I divide it through up and down with a plane, and I divide it through front to back with a plane, as an image there, the natural instinct would be to do what? Obviously, there's another way I can do that, right? I can slice it a third time, couldn't I? Do you see? And when I say restraint, notice, by the way, now notice the unity of the cube, which is the image of what I call the unitary structure of the cube, is only 2/3. See, it's the 1 equals 2/3. It's I am. It's the 1 equals 2/3, which transposes into the distinction from Peirce that in the thinking now occurring, 2 equals 1 times 3, all right, rather than rather than the reverse of that in Peirce, that 1 equals 2 times 3. So what he's saying is that the unity that he's the trichotomic unity that he's striving for is always a 2 times 3 affair, right? And what is being said here is that the trinary unity, the trinary or trichotomic unity, is a 2 which equals the identification of 1 and 3. It's a Trinitarian 2. All right. Another way of putting that, if you're not with me, I can put it theologically. It might help again, depending on how you think. That, in other words, when I have Father and Son in the Augustinian understanding of the Trinity, when I have those two, I already have in those two, because of their relationship to one another, which is love. You see, the principle of unity. I already have the identification of the divine unity with 3. Just so to say. So that's the significance of this otherwise very bare, abstract use of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. It gets even richer in today's assignment later on. You want to say something?
I just don't get that. What is 2/3 about these cubes?
In other words, of the
Plane.
if you slice it through the middle
Yeah.
horizontally and slice it through the middle vertically, which is imaged here, you have one more through the middle slice you could make. You could make another vertical slice
The other way.
opposite.
Right.
Do you see? And then but now why don't you do that? Well, you not only do it because you know that 1 equals 2/3. One does not equal 1. It doesn't equal 3 over 3. It doesn't equal 3 out of 3. It equals 2 out of 3.
Well, I don't know that yet.
No, okay. Well, I'm not asking you to buy it. I'm just
Okay.
laying it out there. But I'll tell you what.
Right.
I think I have the answer to what's bothering you.
Okay.
Because make that. You can even, if you take a piece of paper and draw it yourself. If you put the 3rd slice in, what happens? Anybody know what happens immediately?
No.
You get 8 little cubes. In other words, you go beyond the point where you have imaged the structure of a cube. You're back. You've just multiplied your cube into 8 cubes, but you've lost the internal structure of it.
No, but now you've got 4 cubes.
No, I don't. I have
Four
four
rectangles.
rectangular boxes.
Yeah, whatever those are called. Yeah.
Rhombuses, I think.
It's
It's going to want.
It's not really a cube. It's not a
Actually, you don't
cube.
start
It
with
is a cube, but
Why is it not a cube?
The totality is a cube.
But because it doesn't have equal sides.
Yeah, it does.
Sure.
Oh well.
I
No,
don't
wait a minute.
see that.
This is one of those problems of perception.
Yeah, I know it goes in and
If you
out.
measure with a ruler, you're correct, right?
Okay.
But it's supposed to be drawn in perspective. You have to make an allowance for the perspective issue.
All right.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
If you,
Yeah, I don't see it as a cube. It's very,
yeah, that's
very
okay.
simple.
But you can see where.
I see the lines and divisions and all
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Okay, but all right. Okay. That's a valid point. What happens, by the way, in answer to this comes up in my correspondence with Hoth, the biology work that I'm doing with the fellow in Cincinnati. We have had the occasion to draw some cubes the way Voltraut would want it drawn, where the lines are all equal. And what happens is it's one of these visual tricks. It flattens out. Okay, in other words, then you get you lose, which is nice. I mean, I don't mind it, but I'm trying to start here with some attempt to show clearly the depth of what you would take to be the depth of the cube. And I'm saying that the depth of the cube is when it's defined in terms of these interior planes, to say the 2 cuts, what I call the unitary structure, then this is the setup for saying, number 1, if I go beyond 2 slices to 3, I've lost the unitary structure, and all I've done is multiply my cube. I've just changed the size of it, and I've made 8 cubes instead of 1. And I haven't gotten what I'm looking for, right? The internal understanding of the structure of the cube. It turns out that those interior planes, the area of those interior planes is 25% of 82944. So in other words, what's being said is that when I consider the cube as a unitary structure, as imaged here, right, the total area, that is the obvious surface area of the ordinary cube, plus the 2 planes that define its unitary structure, the total area is exactly 82944, is what's being said. All right. Now, I also thought, and this is going to come up further on when we get more deeply into today's assignment, into the American thought chapter, but it was raised preliminarily by Chuck last time because the issue comes up in our last reading, but it comes up in a more extended form in today's reading, so we don't have to go back at the moment to it. But it's this whole question of the transcendental dichotomy, which is hit hard in today's reading and is mentioned in the last reading. And Chuck's objection, as I heard it at the time, I don't know if objection is the right word, but his quandary or his question had to do with, well, wait a minute, how can we have a transcendental dichotomy if we're leaving behind, I think,
Dichotomy.
the thrust of it, if we're leaving behind dichotomy.
At a high abstract.
It's a great question. It's right to the heart of the matter. I don't know whether we're going to get a great answer, but it's a great question. All right. Now, the reason I'm mentioning at this moment that, because let's save that a little bit till we get into further on the text. Notice here, well, I guess I have to, okay. All right, the first clue is that I thought to reference at this point. Now, I've given you the reference to the more recent stuff about the mathematical linguistic analysis of following Maimonides of I am that I am. 1 equals 2/3, right? Okay. So the unity of this cube equals 2/3 of the slices that what one might imagine making, right, in the natural flow of things, right? So that's one level of reference back, right? Another level of reference back, because I thought of it when I was thinking about Chuck's example, or his question. If you go back to 246, just momentarily, page 246, there's an expression which has always stuck in my mind, although I don't usually have an opportunity to resurrect it, as it were. On 246 and thereabouts, we did hit the notion of the absolute after identity. That thinking is for the first time, right? That's there. But notice on that same page in 246, precisely in the context, and this is very relevant now to a transcendental dichotomy that leaves behind dichotomous thinking, right? So we got the same basic issue here, because we're talking here on page 246 of the thinking now occurring as a absolutely and essentially an after identity, to say. So we have this reference back in the negative to past, what was true in the past, right? And notice there, I say a little above the middle of 246, the after identity now actually occurring for the first time is the inversion of the identity of depth, the double division of the depth of identity, right? The absolute outside, the fourfold of identity, the identity of the fourfold. So, and then I thought, now this takes a little bit of parsing, because the thinking now occurring is doing a thoroughgoing critique of Altizer, but one of the aspects of Altizer's death of God theology, which would take us back to Hegel, which in that sense does go back to Hegel, is Altizer's notion of the absolute self-doubling, you see, or the absolute self-division, you see, of the Godhead, which would be a Hegelian way of putting it, now taken as in the form of incarnation. All right. So the absolute self-division, if it's taken in the pragmatic sense that Altizer takes it in, is the primordial Godhead becoming its own otherness, right? And the self-doubling, therefore, is the self-doubling of the self into its own other. We pretty much did this, right? So wait a minute. So where do I get off talking about, in the context of thinking now occurring, the double division of identity? All right. And what I'm saying is, well, no, it's okay. I didn't say the self-division, self-doubling division of identity. All right. In other words, so it's not the doubling of the division of the depth of identity that's the problem. In fact, that's the answer to what's being said here. What's the problem is that prior to now, what division, as it were, of the depth of identity, which I would almost say that I mean, Altizer comes as close to dividing the depth of identity as he can. I think that comes out if you read carefully today's assignment. But the trick is, or the problem is, or the fly in the ointment, the opaqueness in the subjectivity, you see, is the continuing self-reference, right? The self-doubling of identity, right? So what otherwise would be a flatness is recuperative, right? It's obviously not a complete kenosis. It's not the absolute kenosis of identity, which the thinking now occurring is willing to be understood to be, but it is something short of that. It is the absolute kenosis of identity relatively. Relative to the self, understood, okay? So the reason, all right, so I want to just play around with this notion here on page 246 in terms of the issue that comes up last time and will come up explicitly in a few moments. It's already latent here in this image of a 2/3 division constituting the unitary structure of the cube, is that it reminds me of what I was saying about Anaxagoras. I just finished saying in response to Todd's question that which is a nice question because it allowed me to say this, that in some sense you can see, I think, if you play the tape back, that the thinking now occurring is a synthesis of some very important original truth. I mean, when I say not just truth, by the way, it's part of the originality of Sartre's thought, fundamental to what makes him unique as a thinker, is this evacuation of the ego from the subjective transcendental consciousness, right? So this is not a trivial truth that you know what I'm saying? And the central truth of Husserl, which is the constructive nature, you see, of the transcendental subject, of the transcendental ego, if we can only get rid of the subjectivity. So if you get rid of the subjectivity, get rid of the ego, then we got the synthesis that in a certain sense is one way of understanding the thinking now occurring. But an older synthesis, what I already touched on when I was explaining to you the difference between someone in Epley, I think, the difference between Anaxagoras and Leucippus, that is, the difference between Anaxagoras' notion in the pre-Socratic philosophy that we could divide infinitely through. We would get an infinitely small and an infinitely large, the point being we would never arrive, as the atomists did, at a place smaller than which we could not go. Right? Now, I said that in Anaxagoras, the infinite division, the positive of that, you might say, well, yeah, that would really bother, by the way, that would really bother Aristotle, okay? But Aristotle compared to Anaxagoras is something of a materialist. Yeah, see? Yeah, Aristotle he's an idealist, he's a Platonist. True, bottom line, he's a Platonist, right? But he marries in a way that, until death do them part, and unfortunately for the universe, there's no death. So he marries matter and form in the physical world. Aristotle does. So he's not, compared to Plato, he's a materialist. All right? I have to be careful. You understand what I'm saying? It's all relative. Compared to his master, he's a materialist. But he's anchored in Plato. He's about as materialist you can get and still be faithful to the eternal ideas. Right? That's where Aristotle's at. So relatively speaking, he takes matter seriously in a way which I'm saying in effect, this is not fair to anybody, including Aristotle or Anaxagoras, but retrospectively, if you look back on Anaxagoras from an Aristotelian or post-Aristotelian point of view, Anaxagoras is, now of course Aristotle's point would be that Anaxagoras is dealing in a stage of the history of thought when the distinction that is crucial to him and to Plato between form and matter had not yet been fully articulated, right? Had only been dimly, if at all, perceived by his predecessors. That's what Aristotle understands. So Anaxagoras, what I was about to say was that making all those allowance, all those caveats and qualifications, relatively speaking, Anaxagoras is a pure idealist. That is to say, he understands that there's no end to the intelligibility of the universe. Do you see? If I can divide through the species and I always get another species, a smaller version of all the species of all things, then I'm not fighting matter. I mean, I'm not fighting any potentiality of actuality. You say, I've got a thoroughgoing actuality.
At the level of matter, there's no way of knowing where you are, is Anaxagoras' point, because you can go infinitely up and infinitely down, and so we're not located anywhere in that hierarchy. Therefore, there has to be something else that creates our...
Well, that's the mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, okay. All right.
No?
Yes.
At least that's what I went back and read Kirk and Raven. That was all I could get out of it.
No, that's perfectly right,
Yeah.
Except that now I have to revise what I just said to account, to relate it to what you just said. Okay. That's true. And therefore, if Anaxagoras had a notion of matter, such as comes to be later on in the history of philosophy, he might have distinguished his universe, which is separate from mine, as material. What I'm saying is that what otherwise would be material is, in a thoroughgoing way, formalized, in effect. In other words, it's intelligible, infinitely intelligible. In other words, there's no evidence. I would say the only evidence of materiality there, I'm speaking logically, the only evidence of materiality would be the fact that you can divide through. Right? But the division is perfectly intelligible all the way down or all the way up. Right? Mind, as the initiator, the what will become in Aristotle the unmoved mover, right? The initiator of the motion of what we would call the physical universe, right, is separate from it as the initiator of all of this specificity. What I would say then, since you raised the question that way, I don't want to get off to. I mean, now we're doing Anaxagoras, which is not the whole point, but now that I'm thinking about it, I might as well just say that if there's a kind of dualism or a kind of separateness, which there is between mind and the universe in Anaxagoras thinking, it's a very Greek separateness. It's not so much a matter-form distinction as it is the distinction between the kind of active knowing of a divine mind, you say, which doesn't deal with species and genera, right, and a world which is totally specific through and through. Okay. But where I was going was, right, setting aside the matter-form question, the infinite specificity and intelligibility, and therefore, in that sense, the pure formality of Anaxagoras' world, in terms of my critique of the proper understanding of Aristotle, what's missing in that infinitely specified universe of Anaxagoras in the context of Novitas Mundi's understanding of Aristotle is essence. And essence would have to be associated retrospectively with the nous, the divine mind that moves that world in Anaxagoras. But where I was going, I was just rehearsing the point I made a couple of meetings back, that the alternative to Anaxagoras was the atomic theory, in which I come to a point, even though it's perceptually invisible, and in that sense, perceptually infinitely divisible matter, right? But it's not actually ontologically so. It's not really so, because even though I can't see the atoms, in principle, the atomic theory says there is a point where I can no longer make a division. Now, the irony is that it would be understood in Greek terms, certainly subsequently, as the point of a sheer conglomeration of mindless pieces of matter. Right? So there's a limit in the atomic theory, but the price for the presence of the limit is that at that level of the limit of the division, I'm dealing with a substratum or substrata, a composition of things which in and of themselves are unintelligible. Right? They are nuggets of matter, as it were, pure matter, as it were. So I said the thinking now occurring is the synthesis in the notion that the minimum, right, is, I think somewhere in the text I actually say it this way, or I don't know if we hit it in class at the time. The minimum has a number of ways of being translated. Obviously, it's the foundation. It's the foundation of logic itself in the context of today's reading. But one way of understanding it is specified in the text as it's the limit of the infinitesimal, right? And it's right there in that kind of phraseology you get what I'm driving at. In other words, it's the limit of what otherwise would be an infinite division, such that I can have, as it were, the infinite intelligibility, you see, of the world, but not at the expense of the limit, right? So in atomism, I have the limit at the expense of intelligibility. In Anaxagoras, I've got unending intelligibility, all the way down, all the way up, any way you want to slice it. But what I have is no limitation, right? In Chuck's terms, I don't know where I am. Right? Might be a way of characterize, right? And when I know where I am, as it were, by analogy, rough analogy, in the atomic theory, I know where I am at the expense of the ultimate intelligibility of things. All right. So the thinking now occurring, we have that synthesis going on too. And so on this double division of identity, which I triggered back to 246, when I'm looking at this image again, anew, in the context of this course, I think, yeah, there's a limit to the division of this depth, literally. Do you see? The limit of the division of the depth of the cube, to the extent to which we allow that for openness, right? The limit of the division of the depth of the cube is the 2/3 move. It's the unity equals 2/3. You see? It is, in that sense, all right, it is in that sense the notion of the identification of logic with the minimum, or the identification of logic as the minimum, which comes up in later on. Okay, so again, this abstract, visual, geometric way of articulating the thought is, I'm just trying to, in some sense, demonstrate its relatedness to the conceptual matter, which is difficult in its own right. Then, to make things worse, on page 243, I take the cube, on page 243, the same cube, which you have to imagine, if you buy, for the sake of argument, I'm using the wrong language, page 435 and 437. 435 and 437. All right, so the cube on 435, which we've just been discussing, the unitary structure of which is a 2/3 division of the possible 3 slices through the middle, recreated on page 437, now superimposing on it the fourfold rotation, going back to the logical chapter, the fourfold foundation rotation of what I call the cornerstone, right? And starting, I mean, you wouldn't have, it doesn't make any difference where you start, as long as you follow the order, right? But I started in the lower left-hand corner. That would represent the 4, 1, 2, 3. So it's 4, 1 on the bottom, then 2 and 3 going around, as it were, in a counterclockwise move, right? And so you have the foundation that's there laid out linearly in the logical chapter, just superimposed on the side of that cube, the justification, as it were, the logical justification for the superposition of the fourfold rotation of the cornerstone on the side of this cube is that the unitary structure of the cube gives me the places for the fourfold rotation. So it divides the sides, the front and back of the cube, into the 4 places, so to speak, in which one now sees naturally the logical digits. And therefore, it's really powerful. It's very powerful mathematically. It's more powerful since it was not understood at the time. Okay? So there are 36 boxes on the side of the cube. Okay? Right? There are 4 nines. So you know. Now, there's no mathematics here yet. Okay? I mean, at least in this image, there's no mathematics. But it turns out that a cube whose diameter is 144 units, okay, is the only cube the side of which divided into 36 units.
What do you
The
mean?
only
What is the diameter that's 144 units? What does that mean?
the diameter of the side of this cube. It's not drawn here. It's not drawn here. It's the basis for the previous understanding of the size of the cube. It's not drawn. It's verbalized on page 434. The diameter is not drawn. Okay? But what I'm saying to you is the discussion here on these pages, it's got 2 levels. Right? There's the immediate raw geometric level, and then there's the mathematical understanding of this particular geometry. What I'm saying is, even though it's not drawn, that a cube, the side of which can be divided into 36 equal squares, as the application of the logical cornerstone to this cube does, that such a cube, mathematically, all right, will be such that the circumference in which that side of that cube is inscribed the circumference, will equal the area of the circle in which each of those 36 subsquares is inscribed. The circumference of the circumference in which the side of the cube is inscribed will equal the area of the circle in which each of the 36 circles, to be more explicit, in which each of the 36 squares is inscribed. And what is that number?
Wait a minute, isn't that trivially so? I mean, this.
What do you mean trivially so?
6 by 6, 6 by 6. Each circle around is going to be the same as one of this way because it's set up 6 by 6. So how could it not be what you? That equation is just ordinarily, unless I'm missing something.
No.
Yeah. I mean,
No,
just
that's all right.
in perfectly ordinary arithmetic, it would have to be the same.
Or putting it differently,
Right.
are there any cubes as to which this observation does not apply?
There are no other cubes.
Yeah. It would be true of any cube.
By
No.
definition.
When you say of any cube, what do you mean?
Any cube, if it's 6 by
Any
6 or
cube,
2 by
any
2
cube of
or
its side
50
was
by
divided
50,
into 36 parts.
or any number. If it's 7 by 7, it's still going to be. It isn't anything peculiar to its being 6 by 6 that makes that. So unless I'm misunderstanding what you're saying.
Well,
you have a ring that goes
I
around
wanna say
each
that-
of these 6 things, and a ring that goes around it horizontally.
Right, that's correct.
If it's 6 by 6, of
Right.
course it's going to be the same. If it would be true, it was the same. If it was 11 by 11, because the horizontal is the same as the vertical.
let me restate it and see if we're on the
Okay,
same wavelength.
all right.
I'm saying that
You-
the
you
circumference.
follow?
I'm saying the circumference
Yeah.
of the side of the cube,
The circle inside of which the side is
the length, the circumference of that circle, equals the area. The area, not the circumference, equals the area of the circles
36.
of the 36
Of the
circles
sum.
of each of the of each of the 36 circles surrounding each of the 36 subsquares.
But that's like saying it's equal to the area of itself, because the area, each of these circles is the same as the horizontal circles. There would be no difference. Why would it be any different?
Well, each of the 36 circles is very small compared to the big circle, right? We agree that there's that difference.
So it's not the circle that's going around the entire 6. It's just the circle that goes around 1.
No, it's both. That's the whole point. The circle that goes around the whole side
That the
has a circumference.
the
I'll tell you what it
circumference
is.
The circumference is equal to the area of what goes around one of these little ones. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Okay.
And
And that's only true of the 6.
I would say that's unique to the 6, and more particularly, what that area of each of the circles, the 36 circles, is, which equals the circumference of the side of the cube, is 144 pi. Okay. Okay. I don't want.
Okay.
We could check. You know, if you want to check out, you can do some experiments.
Yeah.
I did some at the time. I can't.
Yeah.
Like Descartes says, you know, I did it. I knew it was right, and thank God there's a God because I remember he would. Okay. So, all right. But what I want to get to here is that this, what you're asked to do here to visualize what I'm talking about in the text, when I talk about this two-sided objectivity being absolutely one-sided. So, I want to say that the absolute dead center cube is, which in one sense is two-sided, because the two sides that, as it were, count, you see, are the sides that are defined by the unitary structure, by the 2/3 slice, right? That those two sides are visually able to be perceived as identical when I transparently superimpose upon them, as it were, or see them in terms of the foundation. In other words, I think you can see the back side is not only identical looking from front to back, you see, but if I were to imagine myself going around the other side of that cube, I wouldn't be able to distinguish it from being on this side of the cube. Do you see what I'm saying? So it is a neat visual attempt, indicial attempt to capture the notion of an absolute dead center, which in one sense is cubic, you see, but whose cube, where the cube itself, the structure of which tells you that the distinction between the second and the third dimensions is at best relative, you see, but in the thinking now occurring is, as it were, eclipsed, transcended if you want, okay? And this is a kind of visual, as it were, representation or evidence of that indistinguishability of what you would take to be the two sides. The two sides are the one side, and the two sides of the cube in that sense are identical.
So n
Yeah.
dimensions is really 2 dimensions. Presumably you could expand this to n dimensions. Or you don't consider that as just 3 dimensions and 2.
Yeah, I don't want to go there. I'd have to think about that. My instinct is to say no. That's another problem. That's another.
Okay, so by flatness you mean 2 dimensions, 3 equals 2.
That the distinction between 2 and 3, which by the way is our ordinary experience of the world.
Yeah.
I mean that distinction. I want to say it's absolutely relativized in the thinking now occurring, such that, and that's why I speak of the infinitely flat structure of the universe. That is, the structure of the universe is flat, but not just in the current philosophical sense, physical sense, not just in a ordinary sense of flat, but infinitely flat, meaning the flatness does not simply erase the ordinary distinction between second and third dimensions, right? So in that sense, I mean, it's probably a very weak analogy, but the analogy of peeling an onion, there's another layer under it which is to be peeled away. In other words, the sense that no matter how you might say, well, we said earlier on in the course, it's novelty all the way down, it's rationality all the way down. I might want to say it's exteriority all the way down, which would be like what I speak of as the absolute exteriority of thinking out.
And that's onion peel.
Yeah, but I don't want to get hung up on that. But it's right. So, but just to say that I don't want to. The ambition of thinking now occurring is not to return to that stage in Western thought, which was pre-perspectival. You see, in other words, it's not. Remember, medieval art is terrific, but it's flat. It's a flat world. Not only did they think the Earth was flat, but they saw the world. They hadn't seen it in 3 dimensions. Otherwise, their painters would have painted in 3 dimensions. Obviously,
Well, that's a bad argument, but don't go there.
I know. Well,
that's not good art history.
Well, I'm going to make it anyway, but I don't mind making a bad argument because I'm not hinging anything on the argument. I'm using it by way of an illustration. It's a cartoon argument, okay? I just want to say that my real point is this is not to go back to a flat Earth or a flat universe notion. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or a pre-perspectival understanding of our experience, right? It's to be absolutely after the perspectival, right? And in that sense, to be beyond, this goes to the transcendental dichotomy idea, beyond the distinction of flatness and perspectivity. Does that make sense? It's to say that distinction, while real in the past, belongs to the past, and that's the break, right?
New flatness.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, not just a new, an essentially new flatness. Yeah. Okay.
So if you rotate this cube on page 437
Right.
90 degrees,
Okay.
and then you have complementary rectangles on top of one another. Where you draw it,
You
right?
would have two.
Right.
Well, you'd have 2 rectangles facing you, right?
Well, I want to say complementary.
Two horizontal rectangles
They're
facing you.
complementary in the same sense that the 36-fold sides here are complementary to each other.
Okay.
Presumably.
Oh, I see what you mean. I got you.
Presumably,
Front and
we're
back.
saying
Front and back.
That the universe, to the extent that the universe can be represented by this, you can collapse the whole thing because, after all, one mirrors
They're
back
bilaterally
of it
symmetrical, so
mirrors the
Okay.
other, and you have the essence of the two in one flat.
Okay, I have no
Right.
problem with that.
Is that right? So let's rotate this thing 90 degrees, and
Not
fill the-
again, or just that one
no,
time?
no. I'm saying that as drawn on page
Yeah,
437.
no, I got that.
You can collapse this. Now we'll turn it 90 degrees, and we'll put in any number of other numbers, but as long as the numbers are the same in those rectangles, as the numbers in the front are the same as the numbers in the back, you can do the same thing, can't
I
you?
don't think so.
Why not?
Then you go with this number business again. If I put a 2, we don't even have to do the rotation. Just take my digits out and put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Well, no,
Okay.
it has to be 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, because it's bilaterally symmetrical. Makes it so that you turn around to the other side, and it's
Well,
the
I don't
same.
care. I don't care what order. But the point I'm making is that 2, if I write 2 in here and 2 in the back, and I go around behind, I'm looking at it backwards too.
Okay. So you're saying that there's no way that using the 3 essential digits over with 2 rectangles on top of one another, that you can create this same symmetry. Is that what you're saying?
No, it's because you.
Well, I could.
Have you ever tried that?
Here's the point.
You've already created the symmetry.
Why would I
in the
do it
nature-
again?
In the nature of
Okay,
the
can you-
rotations of the four figures. So
I want to make sure I'm understanding his question, though. In other words, you're telling me if I rotate this 90 degrees,
No, I'm asking a
I
question.
now have the 2.
I know I'm not supposed to ask a question in class, but I'm asking a question, right? Which is, have you tested the idea that if you take the same 2/3 cube that you've
Right.
drawn here,
Right.
right? And okay, so let's just guess that you've arbitrarily made it a 2/3 cube, and it happens to work out. If you turn this 90 degrees,
I got that.
well, is there any way
Once I
that-
turn it 90 degrees, you want me to fill it in, that blanks, those
Yeah.
2 blank
Yeah,
sides.
you can then subdivide it, of course, as you have the other.
Well, that's the point. Okay. But there's no, you can't do that in this context for this reason. That if I turned it and subdivided it, I'd be back to my 8 cubes. In other words, I don't want to subdivide. I want to understand what I call, I have to invent the jargon, the unitary structure of the cube. If I turned it and divided it again and then put the digits in those sides, I could do that, except that I would have 8 cubes. I wouldn't be doing the same thing as I'm doing here. I'd be doing something different.
So what's the significance of doing this as opposed to doing that?
It's
an
to
arbitrary selection.
No.
It's an arbitrary selection. Isn't
What's arbitrary?
it? That you've decided to draw 36 squares on the front and back of this cube.
Correct.
As opposed to some other number of squares.
Well, it's all right. You say arbitrary. Again, I resort to context. In the context, it's not arbitrary because without any notion of putting those logical digits on that cube on 437, for other purely conceptual reasons, the places into which those digits are put on 437 is discovered on 435. In other words, on 435, 2 of those, the front and back sides of the cube on 435, are each divided into four equal squares. Right? That 4 squareness, right, is the consequence. It's not a setup. It's the consequence of the 2/3 division of the cube. Just the consequence. If there were a 3/3 division of the cube, then there would be 4 equal squares on every side of the cube. So you say arbitrary. I say no, not arbitrary. I've explained to you the reason why there is not a 3rd division. A 3rd division would not image the unitary structure of the cube. It would give me 6.
Final question, then
8
I'll
cubes.
go home. All right.
All right.
The question is, if instead of looking at the universe this way,
Right.
with this front and backedness,
Right.
essential front
Right.
frontedness and backedness, if you rotated this thing 90 degrees and you don't get the same collapse, you don't get the same identical collapse, then where's your argument that the universe, no matter how you cut it,
I'm glad you asked that
is-
question. This is why I want you never to go home, Jim. I want you to persist in these questions, because when you rotate it 20 degrees and resist the temptation to ignore the restraint of only slicing the cube 2 out of 3 times, when you turn the cube, only slice 2 out of 3 times, 90 degrees as you want, and if I were to look at that straight on, I would see, as I think you've already said, I think you said this a few minutes ago, I'm going to see cube, a rectangle over a rectangle, and if I have a perfectly straight-on view, that's all I'm going to see. I'm going to see a square divided through the middle. That's all I'm going to see.
Can I ask?
Wait a minute. No, let me finish, Chuck. Are we agreed? Are we talking about the same thing?
Go ahead.
Okay. But when I look down on the cube, so to speak, I see that what I will actually be looking at is 3 superimposed planes. And so you've helped me tremendously, because the cube, whether I look at it the way I've got it, I want you to look at it here, or whether I say, okay, Jim, we'll turn it 90 degrees, I find that looking at it the way I'm telling you, there are 2 planes, front and back. There's no middle plane. The way you want to look at it, there are 3 planes. And what am I saying? I'm saying that 1 equals 2, 3 predicated of 2, or I could say 2 predicated of 3, 2/3, or 1.5. Do you see that?
I see. It depends on how you look at it.
Well,
That's perspective.
Well, what I've just said, thanks to your question, is that it's really not a matter of perspective. The totality of the cube is, right? And then if I take only one view, which is what you were objecting to, right? Then I've got 2 planes. If I take into account your perspective, as you call it, now I have both perspectives. You see? Now I have, and that's the totality. And they're not, and the real point in terms of the conceptualization of thing now occurring is that what otherwise we would think of traditionally, our mindset, we habitually think these as perspectives. The real point is that the so-called perspectives are by no means incompatible. I mean, you're saying they fit together perfectly. That's the actual point. Okay, I just want to, in passing, I want to get into. I'm really anxious to do today's assignment, but I can't resist pointing out to you, just on the same theme of the magic of the. See, Chuck said, I was excited about the fact that the mathematics comes out of the Hebrew because it's improbable or something like that. And I pointed out last time, and I want to reiterate it, the excitement comes not from comparison to what you might have expected. It's not an expectancy-based, right, appreciation. It's the fit. You see, it's the fit. I would say, technically speaking, makes no difference to me whether anybody, in fact, I would say, technically speaking, no one intended this. No ancient scribes and no primordial God. It's just the way it is. It has nothing to do with intentionality. It just fits. Okay. So in that line, I'm doing this. Now I go back to the mathematics of this problematic geometry of the cube, right? And so I apply the numbers, and I won't go through all the intricacies of it, but there on page 438, you get a kind of summary application of the mathematical dimensions of this dead center cube. Right, and it all proves to 1. Right, it works out the proportion between what that is. By the way, that long line there, beginning 8.1945, then the 1.22, which is repeated. That proportion in the bottom half of 438. Well, basically, what that is, you can understand it in terms of the cube if you understand that the means in that proportion, the 1.22, etc., which is repeated. Right, the first is to the second, is the second is the third, but the second. The second and the third they're identical, okay? Well, what is that number? That number is the total superficies of the cube. Superficies is a technical mathematical term that I don't think mathematicians use anymore. It means all the lines of a cube. Right? A cube is a square, has a perimeter, 4 lines. So a 3-dimensional cube is a square. All those lines that constitute the cube. Edges, yeah, thanks. The sum of the lengths of the edges of the dead center cube is whatever it says here. It's 1221.88 because I've used the exponential there, right? So now, all right. So the first number is 2/3 of that. Now there's a logic. I don't think it's worth our time to necessarily go through it now, but. It's not there just because it's 2/3. I'm just pointing out to you nicely it is 2/3, but it's a consequence of the previous mathematics here. And you'll notice that the last number, the 1.8, is 1.5 of the periphery of the superficie of the cube. So it's also related as the inverse of 2/3. Now, when I prove the proportion, I'm going to get 1, but on the way to 1, I want to savor this, right? Somebody was telling me, John Keats, you must know about this. John Keats wrote a letter to his brother telling him how to eat a peach. You ever come across that one? You know what I'm talking about? And it was like, whoever was describing this, it was, did you see, anybody watch PBS? Maurice Sendak, the children's author, was on Bill Moyer's on Now, Friday night, and it was great. I mean, he's really very human fellow, very human. And anyway, I don't know how the heck it came up, but he described, I guess they get to talk about the ripeness of death, and so, Shakespeare says the ripeness is all. We don't have much control over being born and being died, but presumably have some control over whether you're ready to be harvested. Anyway, so Sendak gets it. That made him think, ripeness made him think of Keats's letter to his brother about how to eat a peach. Right? And the point is, Sendak's version of that was, it was like an orgasm. It was just, swallow the juice from down your mouth, really savor it, okay? So, in that spirit, it's amazing, right? Now when Aristotle says there's no greater pleasure than intellectual activity, now you get a sense of what he's talking about. All right? So it proves to these two numbers. Well, here's the thing. All right? Over on page, the next page, 439, in footnote 163, I quote in the Greek, Revelation, very famous line in Revelation, right? I translated it right away there. They are accomplished facts. I am the Alpha, at once the Omega, the beginning, even the end. Well, it turns out that I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, in the Greek, the integral product of that is 1.492992 times 10 to the 31st. Square root. Okay. In other words, the mathematics fits that, and even better than that. Now, wait a minute. So I wish I had done this in the footnote. I would have to tell you this, right? But this is just between us. If I just break down that passage which says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, I just take I am the Alpha and the Omega. The integral product of the Greek is 8.2944. You wouldn't be surprised to know that, would you? Times 10 to the 32nd. Well, all I know, right? Beauty is truth and truth is beauty, said Keats when he wasn't writing to his brother, all right? It's beautiful and it's true. It fits. It works.
This is what was going on in Tent in the Secret Gospel of Mark, by the way.
These people are always looking for conspiracy theories. There's thinking now occurring. There's no conspiracy here. It's just the way it is. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip over those technical chapters, which by now I don't think we need to talk about unless anybody had a particular question about them. I'd be happy to entertain it, but they're just working out what we've talked about, I think, enough. The second of those two chapters, then chapter 7 or whatever, is just applying the same methodology to see what other natural numbers, now, it has nothing to do with the language, have the property of their integral products being some whole part of themselves, and that's the result of that exploration. By the way, well, since I'm on that point, you will notice on page, I shouldn't really skip over it entirely, on page 446, if you go down to those numbers whose integral product is 1/4 of themselves, I got that right? Yeah. You'll notice that number I was just talking about, which is the integral product, which is the square of the integral product of I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, is right there as one of these relatively unique numbers. And it'll come up again when we get into the next, not this one, when we get further into this chapter that we enter into today, because that number, along with the other unique number that appears over as 1/9 of itself, integral product 1/9 of itself on 447, the 2985984, those products that share something in common with 82944, those numbers will turn out to be integral products of Greek phrases for, speaking of the Eucharist, what the priest, if he was speaking Greek, would say to you when you go up to communion, soma Christou, the body of Christ, right? So the Eucharistic notion here, the linguistic and mathematical coincidence, is thoroughgoing. It's thoroughgoing. But I just call it to your attention. So this is a very dry table of numbers, okay? But the numbers we know, I know, and you come to know, have a deeper meaning than might meet the eye, appear at first sight. Okay, let's get into the American Thought chapter, which begins at 451. And it starts off by framing the framework. I gave this as a talk in 1985 there in Puerto Rico, and that, I think, accounts for the fact that the first few pages of this talk, I think you would notice in reading it, are pretty much a summary, reworking, something of an explication of some of the issues that have been developed in the text up until this point. Not the least.
They're so helpful to read.
Was it helpful?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, that's good. And not the least of which is the transcendental dichotomy, which I want to zero in on. Okay. But the doubt thing, we were talking about last time, that modern thought does all kinds of doubting, even an absolute doubt. But even when it absolutely doubts the knowledge of what is transcendent, it doesn't essentially do so, right? So the thinking now occurring would be the essential such doubt, and that whole notion is reiterated. So that issue I think we encountered on 420 and following, but I'm not going to go back to it now. Let me just verbalize the three questions that this chapter is dealing with. The first one is, what is the essence of the New World Order now actually existing? Second, what is the essence of American thought? Third, what is the essence of the relationship of American thought and the New World Order? Right. So, the answer to the third question, which I think we touch on a little bit in the text today, is subsumption. So the thinking now occurring is not to be confused with or reduced to American thought as it's understood in this text, right? But like everything else, right? It's not to be reduced to phenomenology in the Husserlian sense or Sartre or whatever, and yet, nevertheless, it presupposes it historically, right? It presupposes it as historical matter and presupposes something of the truth in it, but it subsumes it in the sense that it transcends it, right? That it has a place for it within its understanding of the history of thought, but it is not reducible to it. All right. So then on page 452 and 53, I do a little fuller treatment of that doubting issue that was in the previous assignment, and I want to, and I go through on page 453 through Hegel and Marx, and then Kierkegaard and Husserl and Heidegger. I think I want to start for our purposes on page 454 to get into that at the end of it, so to speak, because that's the proximate place for as it were, the beginning of the thinking now occurring. And I say in the third line, just now in Derrida, the time of the abyss is diffracted, the abyss intact, at once the abyss of thought, perception not perception, the undoubting transcendence of the absolute doubt of the knowledge of what is transcendent, the deconstruction of the identity of thought, of the thought of identity. And just now, in the American theology of the death of God, in Altizer, this diffracted time of the abyss is inverted to the form of the self-division of God alone. So there we have that division issue again, right? And the issue then is not simply the matter of dividing. Because I think what I was thinking in terms of this, which again is relevant to the double division of the depth of identity, and at once on a different level, the transcendental dichotomy, which dichotomizes an essentially non-dichotomous thinking from the dichotomous thinking that precedes it, you see? And so that's the kind of paradox that Chuck is noting. But I think it goes back to the minimum idea. If you just abstract from the notion of a double division of identity, bracket the question of depth a moment, the one transcription of that would be, it's the division, the thinking now occurring is the division of identity. So now I want to drop the identity part, put that in the brackets. Now thinking now occurring in some sense is the division of the division. Or by analogy, therefore, I want to say something like it's the dichotomy of dichotomy. Right? I'm almost tempted to say, which I say about the epoch, thinking now occurring as the epoch to end all epochs. You could say it's something like the dichotomy to end all dichotomies, right? Which is paradoxical, but not unintelligible. In other words, now this is very abstract, but if one can think division, what would it mean to divide division? Well, it would put an end to division. Just saying, and it's related to that notion that the minimum, in some sense, is the infinitesimal limit, or the limit on the infinitesimal, or the perfect coincidence of intelligibility, right, and limitation, right? Or you might say intelligibility and particularity, intelligibility and I want to say immediacy. Okay. So, back here on the page. So in Altizer, the self-division of God alone, at once the division of time from self, of consciousness from self, in the form of absolute solitude, in the form of that total evacuation of interior identity and individuality, which qua world time, qua expectancy, is the identity of a new humanity. So there, in effect, when I was rereading this, I was thinking, there is a nice, neat summary of something I'm doing in a much more, as it were, complicated way in section 2.4. No, yeah, 2.4, where that chapter, which I call the Altizer chapter, which is kind of exclusively devoted to placing him, where, in effect, if you go back and look at that ad hoc notation there, that quasi-mathematical, logical use of the symbols, in effect, is relating in a deep way, relating Altizer to Heidegger and to Derrida simultaneously, but then again as something original and new. All right. So here, in a much more straightforward way, what I'm saying is that Altizer's death of God theology is the total evacuation of interior identity and individuality, which is, in Altizer's language, the undefinable, inconceivable sense, for want of a better word, of a new humanity. And the reason it is that kind of indefinable, inconceivable new humanity in Altizer is because he is still under the influence of the expectancy, which is the root of temporality in Heidegger, as we did in one or two sessions back. All right, so this division from self of the identity of solitude is the undoubting inversion of the absolute doubting of identity, the essential division of the knowledge of what is transcendent from self, the furthest possible extension of the essence of modern consciousness, the time absolutely before now. And let me just pause there. That's a phrase which I think I'm using. I'm not sure I'm using it for the first time about Altizer here. It may appear earlier. But it's one that I've come to believe is a nice summary statement of where the death of God theology comes in the history of modern thought as its furthest possible extension. But I want to say, you could read that a couple of different ways, right? How far can modern thought extend? Well, this is the furthest possible that it can extend. That's the death of God, Altizer's sense of the word, and that's quite legitimate. But it has another connotation which comes out in the comparison between Altizer and Levinas, which I do in a couple of places and maybe do most thoroughly in this forthcoming book of Sunni book, which will be a compilation of essays in critique of Altizer's, one of which I contributed, in which I compare him in some depth to Levinas. And I think it's in that chapter. It's not important whether it's there, but I'm just trying to locate it for you in case that's where it is. I think it is. Where when I juxtapose Levinas and Altizer, I find myself identifying Levinas as the furthest possible intention, internalization, as it were, furthest possible withdrawal of modern consciousness. Now, the key, you say, wait a minute, hold it. Did you read? I thought Kierkegaard was your big inwardness man. I thought he was. I mean, how could you do? But I said, furthest possible interiorization, internalization, intention of, right? The inwardness of Kierkegaard is self-avowedly and absolutely impossible. It's impossible. and if you read Levinas carefully, and I quote Levinas's critique of, and that's why Levinas is modern in a sense. He's an ameliorator, right? He's a critique of modern consciousness. That's his project, to critique modern consciousness, but not to get beyond it. Certainly not in the Kierkegaardian way. So when he reads Kierkegaard, I would say he interprets him backwards into modern modern consciousness.
That's very interesting because you have Maurice Blanchot, who in many ways is exactly parallel Levinas, and they were very, very close.
Mm-hmm.
He uses the word impossible exactly at that site where you would be using the word possible.
Oh, impossible.
Yeah, well, but exactly the point when you want to.
Speaking of Levinas?
Well, in the articulation of ideas that are almost exactly parallel to Levinas,
Okay.
for instance, this kind of a cosmic immemorial, the givenness of the self to the others. He talks about it as an impossibility.
I know. Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, I hear that, and the distinction I would make, not knowing your reference point, is that what I'm saying is that Levinas's work, his project, his place in history, is the furthest possible interiorization. I don't think that's incompatible with the notion that where he winds up in the furthest possible interiority is the impossibility of the possibilities of being immemorially and forever pregnant with the other.
But with the notion that it's not about the possibilities of either a Heidegger or a Husserl.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So
could you just restate
which one?
What you said about Kierkegaard's relationship?
Oh, I said. Well, I said if I say of Levinas that he represents, in the context of thinking now occurring, the furthest possible intention as opposed to extension, inwardness, as it were, I raised an objection against my saying that. I objected to myself saying that on the grounds that, wait a minute, I thought Kierkegaard had done more than anybody could in terms of an absolute inwardness. And then I said, yes, but when Kierkegaard is the furthest inwardness of modern consciousness, it is explicitly in Kierkegaard an impossible move. It's an impossible move. Not just.
It's absurd.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that would be a simple way of doing it. So the essence of the New World Order is the creation of a new world. The essence is to create a new world. Categorically, the creation of a new world is not self-creation. Now, this is a. Let me just do this just in case. This is a very simple thing. This is one of the advantages of doing Novitas Mundi over again on the phone and doing this over again and so forth. And again, Voltaire was asking me some question earlier on, maybe before class, and I was saying that one of the things I get out of this is that not so much that I'm finding that what I thought was wrong, but that there is hopefully a furthering of what I understand about that thinking, and maybe a clarification, and certainly in a pedagogical context, a desire and possibly a success at somewhat simplifying it and making more direct the message, right? So in this context, I was provoked to think, because I was reading Novitas Mundi in the context of this other class, and I was reading the passage in which Kant, rereading, right, for the umpteenth time. It's amazing. If the text is worthwhile, there's no such thing as reading it too many times. This has absolutely no sense to stop reading it if it's an immortal text, right? So I'm reading Kant talking about, in his critique of Descartes, basically, right? No, his critique it's a critique of Descartes, but immediately of Hume, and I've already mentioned it, that Hume's problem, from Kant's perspective, is that it never occurred to Hume that the understanding was the author of its own experience. If it's the author of its own experience, then we can have a priori concepts, do you see, in a way that Hume would deny it, right? Because Hume wants to say, unlike Locke, Kant says, Locke says, that you can derive your concepts from experience. And Kant says, there's no grounds for that. And Hume, agreeing in effect with Kant that Locke is wrong to think that he can derive a priori concepts from experience, says there are no a priori concepts, they're all convention. All our concepts, this is Hume's skepticism, all our concepts are merely matters of convention that don't correspond to reality at all, right? That's what we call things, kind of extreme nominalism.
But there's no picture of exactly how we come to invent the conventions,
well, okay.
which is finally what the
Okay. But anyway, Kant's solution to that problem of Hume's is to say, well, if we are the authors in the first place of our experience, then the concepts by which we organize it can be our priority because they belong to the creative, what I would call constructive, or even I think Kant would call productive intellect, right? I think he speaks of the productive imagination. I like constructive. It comes to the same thing, right? Now, here's the point. My little review here, which I want to get out, the text supports this discussion. Go back to Descartes. We noticed recently, for a couple of reasons, that Descartes has the effrontery, the temerity, the chutzpah. I mean, not only to doubt everything. Okay, he did that. But now he's applying his methodology. He's applying the essence of what he did. And I think I pointed out to you a couple of times. He says, well, now line up everything in order. When I compare one thing to another, we've got to put them in order to do that. And of course, normally you would put them in some natural order, right? But he says, if you can't find a natural order, a fictitious order will do. You can create your own order. So now to bring that into conjunction with Kant, Descartes says, in effect, that the human consciousness is the author, I'll use the Kantian language, the author of the order of its experience. That's what Descartes says in Kantian language. The human consciousness is the author of the order of its experience. Kant says, no, that's not radical enough. Even though he's talking about Jung, right? But in effect, he's saying to Descartes, no, it's not that human consciousness is it goes back to the first creation idea of the extended world that we were talking about last time, right? It's not just that you're reconstructing the given world, but no, Kant is you're constructing the world as long as you understand that the world that you're constructing is the world of experience, temporal spatial world, and you further more deeply understand that it originates in human consciousness. That the human consciousness is, I think the German is Urheber, the author, the originator, the creator, probably the producer. Yeah? There must be some other translations, right? So so Descartes, human consciousness is the author, the creator of the order of its experience. Kant, no. Human consciousness is the author, the creator of its experience, period. That's where Kant is at, right? Now, the qualification there is of its experience, where experience, phenomenal appearance, is radically dualistically distinguished from things in themselves, the substance. Along comes Hegel, and what is Hegel saying in Kantian language? The human consciousness, which is essentially divine, which is substantially at one with the divine, is the author, qua substantial unity with the divine, is the author, yes, Kant, it's the author of its experience, but it's the experience of which it is the author is substantial. It is the author of its experience where experience is not a dualistic abstraction from the things in themselves, where the experience is the appearance of the things in themselves. So it is in a thoroughgoing way, the absoluteness of Hegel's doubt, as I call it, right? The absoluteness of the doubt, the absolute doubt of the knowledge of what is transcendent in Hegel is absolute in the sense that it goes through, literally, this is a very Hegelian way of thinking and speaking. It's the thoroughgoing, I'll slow that film down, the through-going, the thorough, it's the same word in English, Germanic word, right? The thoroughgoing, it goes through entirely to the substance of things. That's what Hegel is saying. So
penetrates.
Huh?
Penetrates.
Yeah. Okay.
In German, durchgehen would be...
okay. Oh, good. That's good. Thank you. Because, remember, we're into absolute penetration here.
Yeah.
So now... Okay, so in Descartes, and so now this goes into the basic notion that the thinking now occurring is not an attack in any simple-minded sense upon the history of thought, even not a simple-minded attack upon the history of modern thought, but in fact it is the salvation, it is the realization of what qua expectancy intrinsically can never be realized, because it's always being expected, right? And the realization, however, is the leaving behind, is made possible by the recognition of the pastness of absolute essential pastness of self-consciousness, right? But so now on this track, I just want to, right? So one way of understanding things now occurring, which I think comes up probably in the Marx chapter, where I would use the word construction there, I think, right? That the thinking now occurring is the notion that human consciousness is the author of its experience and of that experience as substantial with two critical qualifications. One, that the ego at the center of this, the author, literally, right? The ego qua author, in Husserlian terms, Husserl's ego is the author of an infinite a priori. You see, it generates an infinite a priori. That's the Husserl's way of putting it. So he's really abstracted something from Kant there and desubstantialized it in a way perhaps more radical than Kant, but also after Hegel it gets complicated. Okay, so in the thinking now occurring, the ego is the constructor of its experience, where experience is substantial, where the distinction between appearance and substance is transcended. Okay, so all right, but where that author is not a self. All right, where in other words, where and since the author now is not the ego, which is a self, where the transcendental personality is therefore, in a sense, absolutely objective in its construction of experience. It produces on the image of. Now, see, Thomas would like this. I mean, he wouldn't like the form of the thinking, but the principle he would buy, and even Descartes, in his own modified way, would buy this, where the authorship, the human authorship of the world, the human creation of the world, is, in a way more perfectly and strictly than would be the case in the 13th century, able to be understood intelligibly to be the created image of the authorship of the world by the omnipotent God. The qualification being, this is, as it were, the finite edition of that. That is, this is the created version of the creative freedom vis-a-vis its product. Do you see? So, in other words, now that requires the I was going to say renovation, but that's a passé term. It requires the novation, the essential newing of the term of creation, which comes out, by the way, in the chapter on to create the absolute edge, right, where I spell it out pretty straightforwardly. But the basic notion, which we already touched upon, is that an omnipotent God who can absolutely create without any loss of its divinity in a way that would makes the Aristotelian God look like a very limited mover. That what that God does in creating is that he creates his image. This would be Thomistic. He creates in the creature his image, but now understood very clearly, he creates the created image of a constructor who can construct something which is absolutely and essentially other. I mean, essentially other, not other than itself. In other words, not related to itself essentially by way of comparison, as it would be in a self-conscious Cartesian or post-Cartesian world. Now, the other subtle point, however, to be made while saying this, is that, and this goes back to the idea of the Eucharist, okay, that the essence of the substance, which is identically the world of appearance, of experience, constructed in perfect freedom by consciousness at this point in history for the first time. The essence of that Eucharistic substance, which the world is now able to be understood to be, in fact, right? The essence of that is what? That it is something that the form of creation, when you break with the self-conscious author of Descartes, Kant, and Hegel, if you get an author that is essentially other conscious, not self-conscious, then the authorship the creation, right, is the creation of an other by means of what I have called all along and resurrected recently over against the expectancy of Heidegger, a productive authoring receptivity. In other words, if there's a paradox here, it's the paradox that the most, in principle, the most perfect ability of consciousness to create the world substantially and experientially is a function, as it were, of the notion, the absence of self, the positive of that, of the notion of that authorship is receptivity. That what one has received in being created is the ability to really create. I'll stop there because I think that's the general idea that I wanted to get out. But I want to zero in on 454 here because at the bottom we get into the transcendental dichotomy again. And in fact, it comes right after where I stopped, I guess. I stopped with categorically the creation of the new world is not self-creation. The transcendental dichotomy is the fact that before now this is transcendence, and that now for the first time this is absolute existence. The transcendental dichotomy is the fact that before now the absolute now is transcendent, and that now for the first time the now is absolute. That now for the first time consciousness is the world concretely and essentially. So again, I think that can be somewhat understood in terms of the explanation I've in effect just given. The transcendental dichotomy is the fact that before now the categorically new is transcendent, and that now there begins a categorically new world consciousness. Right? So the fact that before now there exists the revolutionary imperative, now here I have Marx in mind especially, and that now for the first time existence is essentially revolutionary. All right? That now existence is the existence for the first time essentially and categorically of the other. Later on in the chapter when I'm comparing pragmatism in the hands of Peirce, but generally pragmatism, particularly in the hands of Peirce, to a kind of, I think I already mentioned this by anticipation, a kind of windowed monadology, right? A kind of open window monadology, a kind of seeing the ideal of seeing the other. I think the way I phrased it later on in today's assignment, right? And that's just this contextual way of talking about the basic move from European self-consciousness to American self-consciousness, where the other all of a sudden becomes not simply or finally able to be reduced to the self, where there's that continuing tension so that the three categories of Peirce must remain as uncollapsible, non-superimposable on one another, right? Unlike what he says is true in Hegel, where all three ultimately simply become one. Okay. So what I'm saying in effect here is that at the bottom of this 454, anticipating a more detailed discussion later on in this chapter, that now existence is the existence for the first time essentially and categorically of the other. So in the language later on in the chapter, not simply, so American thought has made an advance over European thought. The advance in the language of this chapter is that it has the ideal of seeing the other. You see? But what's being contrasted in the thinking now occurring, it's not a matter of an ideal other or an ideal of seeing the other. It's a matter of seeing the actual other, or the actual seeing of the other is the distinction that's being made. So the transcendental dichotomy is that now, not before now, there is a universal consciousness, a consciousness universal and perpetual, at once the absolute evidence of the existence of the body. Dropping down a few lines on page 455, the transcendental dichotomy itself is the beginning of existence, which is to say, it is existence begun. I think it was Adam who said in a totally different context last time something about we're already doing it. Right? So the beginning of existence is existence begun. In other words, it is categorically not a project of self-transcendence, whether the latter be of a positive or negative form, in the actual realization of the modern... so this goes to the the realization aspect, being the productive receptivity as being beyond the expectancy or temporality as expectancy. In the actual realization of the modern project, which is this beginning, the modern is absolutely not, right? That is understood here that modern is, the notion of modern here is inseparable from the notion of the ongoing project, all right? So to the extent to which we have realized ontologically in consciousness, have realized the modern project, in that sense the modern absolutely is not, right? Or belongs to the past. The three self source is left behind. In the actual realization of the projected body which is begun, the other is absolute. The transcendental dichotomy, which is the beginning, which is the categorical break with past thinking, is the perception of the absolute body underway. The beginning of the fulfillment of the expectancy, the beginning of the essentially synthetic reality. And so there, the essentially synthetic reality would be another way of getting at this notion of the absolute authorship of an absolute other consciousness, right? So that it is synthetic is another fancy word in philosophy for the putting together, the notion of construction, all right? But now we have an essentially constructed reality. I might also have said here, just to make a point, I might have also said an otherly, it would be awkward English, but I want to make the point philosophically, the otherly synthetic reality, which cuts a couple of things simultaneously, right? That what is constructed does not. Now I've got a problem. The problem's a terrific, very fruitful problem. I started by saying a few minutes ago that somehow or other thinking now occurring is, it's kind of I didn't put it this way. It's kind of a one-upping Thomas, right? Because Thomas has the notion that every agent, and therefore the universal agent that creates the world, every agent produces its likeness in its product. Do you see? So now wait a minute. I want to say that we are now at a point where consciousness is producing another which has an independence that is analogous to the independence which I want to say we can now understand to be absolute, which I will say in the Absolute Edge chapter, an absolute independence, that the creature and the creator are absolutely independent in being. Oh, well, wait a minute. How can I have it both ways? How can I say, well, I'm getting here as far as I go, consistent with Thomas's understanding that, hey, if the creator creates something, you ought to create something that's like a creator. And I'm saying, oh yeah, well, okay, well let's deal with that. Thanks to modern thought, we can now appreciate how thoroughgoing sans self, minus the self consciousness. Thanks to Hegel, I can appreciate how thoroughgoing, how absolutely penetrating, do you see, is that gift of, now here's where I get hung up, see, that gift of the power, the divine power to the creature, which in Thomas is not a big problem, or at least it's a problem he solves by saying, no problem, similitude. And you got it? The intelligible species as the likeness. Okay? So now, how do I get out of this? Well, I'm already out. Because a long, long time ago, thanks to little Adam, we began to notice that the schema in the thinking now occurring is the reality. That is to say, the likeness is not mediating, it's not, it's not creating that, what in Thomas is the implicit bond of self-other relationship, in creation, and in knowledge, I would say more or less explicit epistemological relationship of the knower and the known as self and other in Thomas, right? When the thinking now occurring has in effect transformed what otherwise would be the similitude or the likeness into the very substance, you see, then the creation of another, which is in no sense a self, is consistent with a similitude which is the reality. In other words, a similitude which no longer has the meaning, the past meaning of some intermediary third by which the knower and the known are united.
How is the other absolute in a flat universe?
You're going to forgive me for saying it's absolutely so.
No, I'm not. I mean, I you know.
Well, what I don't know what the question
consistency.
is. What do you mean? What does the question mean?
Well, if there is this absolute other,
Right.
which it says here,
Right.
right? Well, how do you have absolute flatness?
Well, the absolutely or infinitely flat structure of the universe, I said before, is the notion after perspective, after three-dimensionality, to do it shorthand. Not of going back to a flatness that had not been, a two-dimensionality that had not yet expanded into a third dimensionality. But it's going beyond the distinction between the flat in that finite sense, in the finitely flat world, if I can put it that way, and the third dimensional world. So an infinitely flat world is a world in which, not that we can't make any reference to second and third dimensions, but it's understood that fundamentally the distinction collapses. It's not a, I don't know what to say. It's a merely it's a purely relative distinction, I guess, way of putting it.
Is that true of the other as well?
No, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, if the distinction between one dimension and another
Right.
collapses,
Right.
but the other is absolute,
Right.
why isn't there a difference in dimensionality between the whatever it is, not the self, God help us, but that which the other is other to?
Let's see if I have the question. Why is there not a difference in dimensionality? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Between one other.
In this absolutely flat universe, which seems to be multifaceted, of course.
Absolutely. Well, you do have this tendency to drop words out. I have the same problem with Altizer, by the way. Every time he reads my text and the word essence is in the sentence, he leaves it out. When he recapitulates it, he just leaves the word out. Now, I said the infinitely flat structure of the universe. So this is a structured universe that's infinitely flat. Now, is the question, how can another be absolute? And what? And
have no dimensionality.
But I don't think I'm saying it has no dimensionality.
Well, you mean using words.
I'm saying it has an infinitely flat dimensionality. But an infinitely flat dimensionality in the structured universe. So I'm not sure what the problem is. I'm not saying it's finitely flat. I think that's what you're reading. That's what I'm trying. That's one of the things I'm trying to say. By you'll pardon my art history. Okay, I'm not going back to flat images in a pre-modern art world. In other words, when I say the other is flat, absolutely flat, I don't mean a finite flatness. I mean that the other absolutely flat, right, is infinitely flat, meaning flat without being bound by the limitation of either 2 or 3 dimensions. Altizer, I think I mentioned to you in a different context, he just wrote a short, I don't know whether it's actually in print yet, but it might be by now. He wrote a short review for somebody of Foundation. I think it was Foundation. Would that be? Yeah. And I think it's the one you mentioned. I'm not sure of that. But anyway, at the end of it, I put it on my website someplace. I just quote the last paragraph. He actually ends up saying that the thinking now occurring is beyond all postmodernity, in the plural. And the way in which he explains that, the punchline for Altizer is that in the thinking now occurring, what we have, as he puts it, is an absolute either or. And at first blush, it makes me nervous, right? Because when I think of either or, I think of the subjectivity of Kierkegaard, and I think of the self-other type relationship. But if he means it seriously, and I could take it as an absolute either-or in the sense of an absolute dichotomy. You say between, it's either a world in which the difference between second and third dimensions, right? It's either a world, it counts, so to speak, ontologically, or a world in which flatness is understood to be our ordinary finite notion of flatness, or it's completely different, right? In other words, in a certain sense, there is no bridging of that gap, if we can call it a gap, right? But it's an immediate. I mean, it's really not a gap, right? Because it's the immediate difference between the thinking now occurring. It's the immediate difference between, to use the language that I use about Altizer in what I call the Altizer chapter, which comes up again inferentially in today's reading of Altizer, the light-dark image. There I speak of the shining of the light, meaning the thinking now occurring, being that upon which the darkness breaks, right? That is the thinking now occurring, and in the language of this chapter, it subsumes past thought, right? So in that sense, there's really no gap, right? The gap, right? The gap doesn't, right? So whatever the absolute either-or is, the absolute dichotomy, I'm almost tempted to think of it in terms of the absolute edge, which I'll talk about later on in the book, but in terms of the Derrida stuff we did in the footnote there with the slash line as the kind of symbol of for Derrida of the both and, either or, that type of thing, and in effect saying what? That the absolute hymen, the hymen intact in the context of the thinking now occurring, is that line such that there's nothing on either side of it. It's analogous to what in the geometry that we started this class with is an absolutely one-sided surface. You see, but an absolutely one-sided surface, which in an infinitely flat structured universe can be, doing no violence to its absolute one-sidedness, can be seen in a certain context as a two-sidedness, which is one-sided, right? So the
Mobius strip.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that would be a concrete example of something like this. That's right. That's right. The Mobius strip. So in other words, it's not that otherwise we'd be involved in one. Then if that were not the case, if it were not that radical claim of the logic that 1 is 2 or that 2 is 3, right? If that wasn't something new and something that could not be set aside, then we were reduced to what? Either a kind of absolute chaos, an absolute multiplicity, which we, in the self-conscious sense, or we were reduced to some sort of mystical unity, which would not be scientifically productive, right? So if the essential intellectual claim here is that there is a logic that I don't know what the word is, that I don't want to say morphs into, right? That would be a self-conscious way of putting it, right? But a logic that can go through walls, right? A logic that works in the Hebrew and the Greek and the mathematics associated with it easily. Fluid, yeah. Well, okay, maybe. Yeah, that's an absolute fluidity. Well, okay. I'll borrow something from Hegel. Hegel's objection to Kant. He's got so many objections to Kant, right? But one neat objection he has is that the way Hegel would put it is that Kant's understanding of the concepts, the level of understanding, that by which we order the world, the a priori concepts that belong to the understanding which is the author of its experience and therefore can be a priori and not derived from experience and yet not simply conventional. That's Kant's point. Hegel's critique of that is that it's lifeless, right? So when Hegel pushes everything together, when he creates the synthesis of the world of experience and the world of substance, among the other important consequences to Hegel is the history of thought. And you could say the history of concepts. You see, in other words, that concepts are not... Hegel avoids the Platonic temptation of Kant to think of the concepts as unchanging forms, a priori in that sense. You see, Hegel is already on the way to, he's already, as much as you could be in the European consciousness, on the way to pragmatism. You see, in his own way, he's much more of a pragmatist than Kant is, and he wants a notion that the understanding has developed in history, and therefore the concepts are not eternal Platonic ideas. What he lacks is Peirce's much more radical notion that not only have the concepts developed in history, which is still Aristotelian in Hegel, but that they are evolving, which means, in other words, American thought introduces into the fluidity. All right, that will work. The fluidity of the concepts that Hegel wants, vis-a-vis Kant, it introduces the notion of the radical, of the experimental. All right. In other words, the fluidity is an evolutionary fluidity, and therefore it is not an eternal setup as it is in Hegel. You see. Well, the thinking now occurring, I don't know whether fluidity is the right term, but certainly Chuck is right. Over against, in the text at least, in the context, it's a dangerous term. But if you could imagine a fluidity for which we had, if you imagine a fluidity for which we had the perfect, thoroughgoing chemical analysis as fluidity, huh?
We have a word for it today that's perfectly accurate. It's epigenesis, that the forms themselves evolve.
Well, that's perfect. I think epigenesis would be adequate for Peirce. I'm not sure it's adequate for thinking now occurring. In the thinking now occurring, the forms themselves, the constants themselves, are not just fluid in the sense that there's an evolutionary process going on, you see, but they're fluid in the much more original sense, if I can put it that way. It's wrong language too, also wrong language. They are fluid in the sense that we create the damn concepts. We create the concepts. There's no, the thinking now occurring is essentially a new essence, right? It's a new species. It's a new form, right? And in some sense, an absolutely new thinking is absolutely new qua concept. That's what's being said, qua concept. So the incarnation of the transcendental ego would be another aspect of that, another layer of that, right? If the transcendental ego no longer is understood in order to be the transcendental ego, Levinas used the image of floating above the waters of ontology, right? And I make the point in the thinking now occurring, there's no floating above, there's no holding back, there's no, right? That the incarnation means that the spirit has entered into the waters of ontology, which reminds me of Waltheiser, right? He's got the water speaking in today's quotations, you see, in his analysis of what's going on in Joyce. But there you have the fluidity, there you have the primordial water that speaks in Waltheiser's understanding, but it's a water which is still lacking definition. It's the water as the alternative to intelligibility. All right, let me get back to the text. So I notice here on page 456, I say, pursuing this general line of thought, maybe about 7 lines down, toward the end of the 7th line, the essence of American thought is the revolutionary candor of its reversal and inversion of the radical self-doubt of European modernity to the inversion and reversal and inversion to what? To the belief in the a priori possibility of the ideal knowledge of what is transcendent, to that modern realism which is at once succinctly the belief in God and the belief in the a priori impossibility of the knowledge of what is actually transcendent. All right? So in terms of what the thinking now occurring might be understood to be over against that summation of pragmatism, it would be, in some sense, the belief in God, where the knowledge of what is actually transcendent is not only not an impossibility, but is the actuality, and in which I would say more than that. In fact, I do say it later on in the text. It's a rather deep idea I stumble upon, I think. And I take advantage of it in the paper that I gave at the 20th World Congress of Philosophy on Levinas, that by implication, probably in the footnotes, that it's not just the belief in God in the thinking now occurring, in the sense of that traditional self-conscious notion of belief. It's the experience of the divine is part and parcel of the thinking now occurring. You see, it's the experience of the Creator. The experience of the Creator is identically the experience of the absolute freedom of consciousness for the first time in history to create the other absolutely. That is not a belief in God. So that's the point at which very early on we said that whatever this knowing is, it is identically faith, but not faith in a simply subjective sense. It's faith in the sense of experience, right? It's the faith which is the experience of God intellectually for the first time in history. All right. Okay. So now I'm here. This also popped out at me again, only in the context of what we're doing here. So this is very valuable. Toward the bottom of page 456, about 10 or 12 lines up, I'm quoting Peirce, and he's talking about firstness, and he's trying to describe it. And he has, all through his collected works, his shelf plus full of books, all his life, he keeps coming back to this. He never tires of giving one more whack at what firstness is. All right, so Peirce is he's a living embodiment of the notion that you always have to take philosophical language in its context, because he keeps revising the language as the context of his thinking grows. But the germ of it remains identical. He says there might be, about 8 or 9, 10 lines from the bottom of 456, there might be a sort of consciousness or feel. This is what he's talking about. This is his one way of tackling what firstness is. A sort of consciousness. Notice he says a sort of. You're not going to pin him down. Okay? So that's a kind of consciousness. Don't press me, because vagueness is built into reality here. Sort of consciousness, or a sort of feeling you can understand. But notice he's unequivocal here. It's a sort of consciousness with no self. He'll say a minimum amount of self, right? No self. And this feeling might have its tone. There could not even be a degree of vividness of the feeling. The world would be reduced to a quality of an unanalyzed feeling. I cannot, now here's what popped out at me. I cannot call it unity, for even unity supposes plurality. I may call its form firstness, orients, or originality, different words pointing at the same thing. It would be something which is what it is without reference to anything else within it or without it, regardless of all force and all reason. Go on.
It's important to distinguish there are two levels of this firstness that's going on here.
Okay.
One is this description of this pure present moment. Let us consider now what would be beginning as the present instant, as being in the present instant, word utterly cut off from past present, which is a kind of experiential instance of firstness. And the other is the logical structure of firstness, which is what is, I would call it would be something which is what it is without reference to anything else.
Okay.
So that's the logical level, as opposed to the experiential level. And
you want to say that the experiential level is distinguished from it as what? Why?
Well, it's just because because that's what makes it a logic, rather than say the phaneron, the phenomenality.
Right. Okay.
I mean, I think that's important for you, because I think that's where you're.
My inclination is to deny the difference. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's first to attack it,
right,
to hold its difference,
okay, so
that it has the status of logic, and then to deny its difference from the phenomenality, which is an instance of it.
All right. Okay.
You follow what I'm saying?
I think I do. Yes. And, so the bottom line of thinking now occurring is what you're calling the experiential and the categorical.
Okay, but it's
you want to say, to make the distinction first.
Well, yeah, because otherwise it doesn't have the punch of being the logic.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Now, one thing that's popped out at me there was he cannot call this firstness, this what elsewhere he calls it freshness. It's the category of spontaneity. He cannot call it unity, for even unity supposes plurality. All right. And what occurred to me there is that in the context of the thinking now occurring, notice the implication of why he can't call it unity is that it implies a plurality. It implies, right? So what he does not have here is what I would call, in the context of our discussion, going back, starting with Augustine, he doesn't have the notion that firstness is a simplicity, to say, as it were, a kind of unity, for which plurality is not an oppositional idea, right? Okay. So then, anyway, going on, he says, such is the originality of the consciousness of a purely transcendental unity, such is the originality of the essence of... Oh, this is me. For a minute there. Yeah, didn't sound like him. the originality of the consciousness of a purely transcendental unity, such as the originality of the essence of American thought, wherein it mirrors itself unself-consciously in its relation to the past and future, which was Hegel and Kant, to the within and the without, to the force and reason, which was the same as this originality in principle. The fact that American thought is essentially this beginning in principle is absolutely demonstrated from the fact that in addition to the three categories, first and second, thirdness, or different instances of them, monad, dyad, triad, feeling, volition, cognition, beginning, end, means, original, other, medium, being, existence, thought, there is for this consciousness, that is pragmatism, of the transcendence of the purely transcendental unity, neither in fact nor in possibility a fourth category. All right, so there is no, what's going to be developed later on in here, there is no, for Peirce, there is no fourthness. Right? Okay, so this absolutely unself-conscious, pure transcendental consciousness, at once the absolute unconsciousness of the absolute self, is the logical analysis which is not, quoting Peirce, an analysis into existing elements, but the tracing out of relations between absolute concepts. I think that has something to do with the distinction that Chuck was just making between experience and logic or categories. And the reason I'm quoting it here is because I do want to call attention to it, and the punch would be that in the thinking now occurring, this distinction between existence and logic, right, is absolutely denied, all right, or it belongs absolutely to the past. So the identification of the category and the existence, or the categorical identification of the existence is...
But it isn't just categories.
Right.
It's the whole apparatus of the principles of relationship of concepts.
Right.
Which categories is just an element that is the excuse for the transcendental idealism from Plato through Hegel.
Okay.
That's what you're denying. That logic is already inside existence. If you're talking about something outside of existence, you're certainly not going to find logic there.
Right. That's right. Yeah. And if I put it in terms of my mathematical discussion, which we started the class with,
all of that is part of the creativity.
Well, there actually are no existence which are not absolutely relational.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Or absolutely logical. Yeah? Are we on the same wavelength?
Well,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. All right. So you're wanting me to clarify. Okay. Now, he says over on page 458, or I say of Peirce. No, he's still. Where does his quote end? Yeah, his quote ends at the top of 458. Oh, I know what it is. In the bottom of the last part of his quote, about fourth line down on 458, he says, "It is a priori impossible that there should be an independent, indecomposable element, which is what it is relatively to a second, a third, and a fourth." The reason there is no fourth, right? He's going to tell you. The obvious reason is that which combines two will, by repetition, combine any number. In other words, the fourth exceeds what is sufficient. Thirdness, a third, will combine any two or any number of things, as long as I can, in effect, what he's saying is I can reduce any set to two. All right, I can combine any number with a third, and therefore there's no need for the fourth. He says nothing could be simpler. Nothing in philosophy is more important. And then I say, this simplest and most important philosophical fact is the pure relativity of the ideal consciousness, the only necessary condition that there be no actually absolute being, no actually absolute freedom, no indecomposable, not capable of composition, the only necessary condition that the order be ideal, the ideal of transcendental existence, the existence of the transcendental ideal, on the condition that it alone is necessary. If this were theology, now here I tie in, I'm being a little ironic here when I say if this were theology, right? I'm trying to relate the pure logical stance of pragmatism to its theological embodiment in Althuizer. If this were theology, this pure relativity of the real ideal consciousness would be God on the condition of absolute solitude. Indeed, the essentially American theology of the death of God is essentially and necessarily the inversion to nothing of just that conditional existence of God as the absolute solitary. Now, what I'm saying here in effect is that the fourthness that he rules out on the grounds that it's unnecessary, to say, which already tells you something, all right? In other words, it tells you that there remains in pragmatism, in a, I want to say, diluted form, a commitment to necessity, right, which is incompatible with the thinking now occurring, right? So the notion of the kind of unprecedented construction of existence that I was talking about earlier is another form of the polyontology, or another form of an absolute freedom, which is unprecedented historically. And so I wrote in the margin here, when he said that nothing could be simpler than this, that on the contrary, what combining an existence is the absolutely simple. Okay? In other words, fourthness is that which combining, which would be his thirdness, with existence. That fourthness, as that combining, you say, is the absolutely simple, or I might say the absolute simplicity. It is that, just to stick to the text here, it is the indecomposable. In other words, it is the fourth category that, however, itself is not capable of composition. All right. In other words, it is the I don't know whether this is the right term, but it's something like, probably not technically, but it's something like the notion of the matrix, right? I don't mean the movie, although it might have something to do with the movie, right? The notion of the, right? If there is a fourfold rotation of the foundation, if there were such a thing in the thinking now occurring as the space in which that rotation takes place, it's something like that space. But of course, there is no space. To say, in other words, it's thoroughly incarnate in the firstness, secondness, and thirdness. The fourthness is thoroughly incarnate in there as the actuality that it's a kind of like I think earlier on I call it a kind of super firstness, right? A kind of I might call it here a kind of super combinatory actuality. You see, that combines thought with existence. That although combines is his language, that really what I want to say is that identifies thought with existence. That doesn't exist apart from the fact of the identity of thought, the identification of thought and existence. The fact of the identification of thought and existence is the fourthness, do you say, which in that sense thoroughly, in a completely thoroughgoing way, permeates what otherwise, in a very simple sense, is the real trinary logic, the one, the zero, and the unum. And it reminds me of the last time Jim was here, which was a while back, of the objection about the double repetition of the 1, 0, unum equals 1, and Jim wanted to make them numbers, not logical digits, as I was insisting on, and I wanted to say that, well, this had to be, in some sense, two different ones, which would be the denial of the theological context, in which the one God is, like, the three persons, even though one of those persons, the Father, is in some sense the first. He is no more or less that one is no longer less the one the Son of the Spirit. But let me just mention in that repetition of the one on the other side of the equation, right, is analogously the fourthness. You see, in the same sense that I cannot separate the 0, unum, and 1 on this side of the equation. I cannot take them up. I cannot ever say that they are something other than something that is not that unity, right? That as it were that other one. Now that's not a problem in an absolutely other related logic, because otherness doesn't imply the distance of self-relationship, you see, of other self-relationship. This doesn't apply that alternative. So if it is in the absolute either-or in the language of Altice's review, then the absolute either-or is so absolutely the case that there is no either-or. I mean, so I'm a little nervous still about his language, but if you think of it as the absolute hymen, the absolute edge, as I will say later on, the absolute one-sided cube, then the fourthness in that sense is not really separable from its identity as firstness, secondness, and thirdness. Now we pushed the clock, so I'm going to have to stop. I want to say a few more words about this, and then we'll play again a little more catch up. We'll go on with the next assignment, and I find from experience in class that we move a little more quickly ironically through the Hebrew language chapters. I guess because it's not. I think we do so because a lot of it is a lot of space taken up by just laying out the numbers, and so the text is probably not as dense.
Also, we can't think of any questions.
Okay. Well, you have between now and whenever.